Ivan IV of Russia earned his nickname the Terrible for reasons most history textbooks sanitize. In 1570, he didn't just conquer the city of Novgorod, he turned it into his personal buffet of human suffering. For 5 weeks straight, Ivan personally supervised the torture and execution of thousands. Men were roasted alive over open flames while Ivan watched from a specially constructed viewing platform eating his dinner. Women were tied to sleds and dragged into the freezing Volkhov River. Children were thrown to packs of hunting dogs. But here's where it crosses from historical atrocity into pure nightmare. Ivan didn't just watch these executions, he participated. Guards reported seeing the Tsar personally driving stakes through victims, testing different angles and depths like a butcher learning his craft. He'd take breaks to eat elaborate meals prepared by his cooks, sometimes mere feet from the dying. The smell of roasting meat from the kitchens mixed with the smell of burning flesh from the torture grounds. His personal guards, the oprichniki, wore black robes and rode black horses, carrying brooms and dog heads as symbols of their mission to sweep away treason and bite the Tsar's enemies. They weren't just soldiers, they were Ivan's personal death cult. Membership required abandoning your family, swearing absolute loyalty to Ivan above God himself, and participating in regular torture sessions that Ivan called entertainments. The Novgorod massacre started because Ivan suspected the city of planning to defect to Poland. His evidence? A letter that historians now believe was forged. It didn't matter. Ivan needed an outlet for his paranoia, and Novgorod was convenient. By the time he finished, somewhere between 15,000 and 60,000 people were dead. The exact number remains unknown because Ivan ordered all records destroyed. But wait, it gets worse. After weeks of systematic slaughter, Ivan threw a feast. Not a celebration in Moscow, but right there in Novgorod, among the bodies. He invited the surviving merchants and nobles, forced them to eat and drink while corpses rotted in the streets outside. Anyone who refused to appear cheerful was added to the execution list. The feast lasted 3 days. What drove a man to such extremes? Ivan's childhood reads like a blueprint for creating a monster. His father died when he was 3. His mother was likely poisoned when he was 8. The noble families who should have protected the young Tsar instead used him as a pawn, ignoring him for days, letting him go hungry, occasionally beating him for sport. Ivan grew up watching adults torture animals in the palace for fun. By age 13, he'd learned their lessons well. His first act of independent power was having Prince Andrei Shwisky torn apart by dogs. The Novgorod massacre was just Ivan flexing his absolute authority. He'd learned that fear was the only reliable currency in his world. Love could be faked, loyalty could be bought. But terror? Terror was honest. And Ivan craved honesty the way other men craved wine. His paranoia grew with each passing year. He saw traitors everywhere, in his advisors, in his priests, in his wives, especially in his wives. He married at least 7 times, possibly 8. The exact number is disputed because some marriages were so brief they barely made it into the records. What isn't disputed is that several of his wives died under suspicious circumstances. One was forced into a convent, another was drowned, a third was probably poisoned. But Ivan's appetite for cruelty extended far beyond Novgorod and far beyond his enemies. What he did to those closest to him would make the Novgorod massacre look like a warm-up exercise. Ivan transformed the Kremlin into something between a fortress and a torture chamber. Every wall had ears, every shadow could hide an informant. The Tsar's paranoia metastasized into a surveillance state that would make modern dictators jealous. He created a separate territory within Russia called the Oprichnina, essentially his personal police state, where normal laws didn't apply. Within this zone, his black-robed enforcers could do anything, and they did. The oprichniki operated from a fortress monastery in Alexandrov, about 60 miles from Moscow. Ivan designed it himself. The complex featured dungeons, torture chambers, and his personal quarters all within the same building. He wanted convenience. Why travel when you could have your entertainment and your bedroom under the same roof? The monks who lived there weren't holy men. They were Ivan's drinking buddies and torture assistants, wearing monk robes over their oprichniki uniforms. Daily life in Ivan's court was a psychological horror show. Nobles who went to bed wealthy and powerful could wake up to find their families arrested and their estates confiscated. Sometimes they didn't wake up at all. Ivan kept lists, long, detailed lists of people he suspected of disloyalty. The lists included everyone from powerful boyars to random servants who'd looked at him wrong. He'd review these lists during meals, making decisions about who would die that day like other people planned their schedules. The execution methods Ivan preferred weren't quick. He rejected simple beheadings as too merciful. Instead, he collected torture techniques from across Europe and Asia, creating what amounted to a greatest hits compilation of human suffering. There was the rack, which stretched victims until their joints separated. The Iron Maiden, a hollow metal statue lined with spikes. The Pear of Anguish, a metal device inserted into body cavities and then expanded. Ivan owned all of these and more. But his favorite was impalement, not the quick version through the heart, but the slow version practiced in the Ottoman Empire. A stake would be inserted through the victim's rectum and carefully driven through the body, avoiding major organs, so death took hours or even days. Ivan would have dozens of these stakes erected in Red Square, turning Moscow's center into a forest of dying humans. Foreign ambassadors reported the smell was so overwhelming they had to hold perfumed cloths to their faces during meetings. The worst part? Ivan attended these executions personally. He didn't just watch from a distance. He got close. He asked victims questions as they died, about their families, about their alleged crimes, about what dying felt like. Guards reported that he seemed genuinely curious, like a child examining an interesting insect. Sometimes he'd take notes. His court lived in constant terror. Nobles developed elaborate strategies for survival. They learned to read Ivan's moods from the smallest gestures. A certain look meant someone would die that day. A particular tone of voice meant the Tsar was feeling merciful. Maybe. Court fashion became increasingly somber because wearing bright colors might attract attention. Attention meant death. Prince Andrei Kurbsky, one of Ivan's most talented military commanders, eventually couldn't take it anymore. He defected to Poland and wrote Ivan a letter explaining why. Ivan's response was a 30,000-word rant that mixed religious justification with detailed descriptions of how he planned to torture Kurbsky if he ever caught him. The letter rambled for pages, jumping between biblical quotes and graphic threats. It read like the manifesto of a madman, which is exactly what it was. But Ivan's paranoia had a special target. He didn't just suspect his advisors and his nobles. He suspected his own family, his own blood. And what he did to them would prove that being related to Ivan IV was the most dangerous relationship in Russia. The torture chambers beneath the Kremlin ran every single day. The screams became background noise. Servants learned to walk past cells of dying prisoners without reacting. Showing sympathy was treason. Showing horror was treason. The only safe emotion was blank indifference, and even that was risky. Ivan kept a bear in the palace, not as a pet, but as an execution method. Victims would be thrown into the bear's cage, sometimes naked, sometimes covered in honey to attract the animal's attention. The bear was kept hungry. Ivan would watch from a balcony, often while eating. The parallel wasn't lost on anyone. The Tsar and his bear, both apex predators, both kept fed by a steady stream of human suffering. But while Ivan terrorized everyone around him, his own body was preparing its revenge. And the monster who controlled an empire was about to discover he couldn't control his own flesh. Ivan's first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, died in 1560. She was probably the only person Ivan ever genuinely loved, and her death broke whatever remained of his sanity. He immediately suspected poison. He was probably right. The autopsy performed centuries later found abnormally high levels of mercury in her hair. But Ivan's response to grief wasn't mourning. It was wholesale slaughter of anyone he suspected, which meant everyone. His second wife, Maria Temryukovna, survived 8 years before dying under mysterious circumstances. Wife number 3, Marfa Sobakina, died 2 weeks after the wedding. Poison again, probably. Wife 4, Anna Koltovskaya, was forced into a convent after 1 year. Wife 5, Anna Vasilchikova, lasted 1 year before being sent to a convent. Wife 6, Vasilisa Melentieva, died after a few years, possibly drowned on Ivan's orders when he suspected her of adultery. Wife 7, Maria Dolgorukaya, allegedly died the day after the wedding. Some chronicles claim Ivan personally drowned her because she wasn't a virgin, but Ivan's destruction of his own family reached its horrific peak with his son. Ivan Ivanovich, the Tsarevich, was everything his father wasn't. Competent, popular, sane. By 1581, he'd become a genuine military leader and political figure. People whispered that he'd make a better Tsar than his father. Even heard the whispers. On November 16, 1581, the Tsar walked into his son's quarters and found the Tsarevich's pregnant wife, Yelena, lying on a couch in her undergarments. Whether she was simply resting in the heat or dressed inappropriately by Ivan's standards doesn't matter. Ivan beat her savagely with his pointed staff. She miscarried. When his son rushed in to protect his wife, Ivan turned on him. The fight was brief and catastrophic. Ivan struck his son in the head with his iron-pointed staff. The Tsarevich collapsed, blood pouring from his temple. Ivan immediately realized what he'd done. Guards reported hearing the Tsar screaming, "May I be damned! I've killed my son!" He threw himself on his son's body, kissing the wound, trying to stop the bleeding with his hands, wailing like a wounded animal. For 11 days, Ivan Ivanovich lingered between life and death. His father never left his side. Even the Terrible, who'd tortured thousands without remorse, who'd burned cities and impaled children, sat by his son's bed and begged God for mercy. He promised to give up the throne. He promised to enter a monastery. He promised anything. God wasn't interested in deals. The Tsarevich died on November 19th. Ivan had murdered his own heir, the son he'd trained to rule, the one person who could have held Russia together after his death. The succession was now a disaster. His remaining son, Fyodor, was described by contemporaries as simple-minded and completely unprepared to rule. Ivan had destroyed his own dynasty. The guilt consumed him, but it didn't make him better. It made him worse. He'd always been paranoid. Now he was paranoid and grief-stricken. He ordered investigations into who had cursed his son. Hundreds died in the subsequent purges. He couldn't accept that he'd killed his heir through his own rage. Someone must have made him do it. Someone must pay. But Ivan's body wasn't waiting for his mind to finish breaking. The years of stress, rage, and probably syphilis were taking their toll. By 1582, Ivan was falling apart in ways that even his absolute power couldn't hide. His teeth rotted and fell out. Contemporary accounts describe his breath as unbearable, a mix of decay and disease that made conversation at close range nearly impossible. His hair fell out in clumps. His skin developed lesions and sores that wouldn't heal. He swelled grotesquely, his body retaining fluid until he looked like a bloated caricature of his former self. The man who'd terrorized Russia for decades was becoming a walking corpse, and he knew it. The knowledge drove him further into madness. He consulted astrologers who told him he would die on March 18, 1584. When they insisted on the date, Ivan threatened to burn them alive if they were wrong. They stuck to their prediction. Even added them to his list of people to execute after March 18th, assuming he survived. But his mind was going faster than his body. Court records from his final years describe increasingly bizarre behavior. He would sit motionless for hours, staring at nothing. Then he'd explode into rage over trivial matters, ordering executions for imagined slights. He started collecting holy relics obsessively, believing they could cure him. His chambers filled with bones, cloth fragments, and vials of liquid supposedly touched by saints. Nothing worked. The Tsar, who'd built an empire on fear, was discovering that terror had an expiration date, his own. And the final decay would be even more grotesque than anyone watching could imagine. By 1584, Ivan's body was betraying him in spectacular fashion. He could barely walk. Servants carried him everywhere in a specially designed chair, trying not to gag from the smell of infected wounds and rotting flesh. His legs were covered in ulcers that never healed, constantly oozing pus and blood. The stench was so overwhelming that fresh flowers had to be replaced hourly in any room he occupied. But the physical decay was somehow less disturbing than the mental deterioration. Ivan had always been violent and paranoid. Now he was violent, paranoid, and completely detached from reality. He would have conversations with people who weren't there. He'd issue orders to execute men who'd been dead for years. Sometimes he'd wake up screaming about demons tearing at his flesh. His doctors couldn't tell if he was describing nightmares or hallucinations. The suspected culprit for much of his physical decay was syphilis. Ivan had never been faithful to any of his 7 wives, and his sexual appetites ran to the violent and coercive. He'd maintained a steady stream of concubines, servant girls, and women whose refusal would have meant death. The disease, if that's what it was, had decades to work its way through his system, finally reaching his brain in his final years. His spine curved severely, hunching him over until he appeared deformed. His joints swelled with arthritis so severe that he couldn't grip his beloved torture implements anymore. The hands that had personally driven stakes through victims now shook uncontrollably. He tried to hide it, but everyone noticed. The Tsar who'd ruled through physical terror was physically broken. The rage at his own helplessness manifested in increasingly bizarre ways. He ordered his servants to prepare him for meetings with foreign ambassadors by applying thick makeup to hide the lesions on his face. The result made him look like a corpse prepared for burial. Ambassadors reported that meeting Ivan in his final years was like negotiating with an animated skeleton wearing a crown. He developed an obsession with young women, specifically virgins. He believed that sleeping with virgins would cure his diseases and restore his youth. It was an old superstition, medieval nonsense, but Ivan was desperate. A stream of terrified girls, some as young as 12, were brought to his chambers. What happened there isn't fully recorded, but the girls who survived never spoke about it. Most were sent to convents immediately afterward, sworn to silence under threat of death. His appetite became grotesque in different ways. Unable to digest solid food properly, Ivan demanded his meals be pre-chewed by servants before being fed to him like a baby bird. The humiliation of this should have broken him, but he seemed unaware of how pathetic it appeared. The monster who'd feasted while watching executions now couldn't even eat without assistance. The medicines his doctors prescribed were probably killing him faster than his diseases. Mercury treatments for suspected syphilis, bloodletting that left him weak and dizzy, poultices made from animal feces and herbs, a medieval pharmacopoeia of toxins and useless remedies. Each treatment made him worse, but he couldn't stop. The alternative was accepting he was dying, and Ivan's ego couldn't handle that truth. He spent hours examining his reflection, cursing the face that stared back. The handsome young Tsar of his youth had become something monstrous. His eyes bulged from their sockets. His skin had a grayish-yellow tone. His lips were cracked and bleeding. He looked exactly like what he was, a man being consumed from the inside out. But vanity wasn't his only remaining vice. His paranoia reached levels that seemed impossible. He ordered the execution of his personal doctors for failing to cure him. Then he brought in new doctors and executed them too when they couldn't perform miracles. He had his astrologers tortured for predicting his death, then consulted new astrologers who told him the same thing. The cycle never ended. By March 1584, Ivan knew the end was close. The astrologers had been right about the date. His body was shutting down system by system, but he refused to die quietly. He refused to die with dignity. The terrible Tsar would meet death the same way he'd lived, screaming defiance at forces he couldn't control. What happened in his final hours would confirm everything his subjects suspected, that Ivan IV wasn't just a monster in life. He'd become something even worse in death. March 18th, 1584. The date the astrologers had predicted for Ivan's death. He woke that morning in a surprisingly good mood, almost manic. He'd survived. The astrologers were wrong. He called for them to be brought to his chambers so he could watch them burn alive as punishment for their false prophecy. But his servants noticed something the Tsar couldn't see. His skin had taken on a waxy, translucent quality. His breathing was shallow and irregular. He was dying, just not fast enough to notice himself. Ivan demanded a bath. His servants carried him to the bathhouse, lowered him into the warm water. He seemed to relax for the first time in months. He even joked with his attendants, something he hadn't done in years. They helped him out, dried him, dressed him in fresh clothes. He asked for his chessboard. He wanted to play a game. They carried him back to his chamber and set up the chess pieces. Ivan tried to position his king on the board, but his hands wouldn't cooperate. The piece kept falling over. He tried again. It fell again. A look of confusion crossed his face. Then fear. Then nothing. Ivan IV of Russia, the terrible Tsar, collapsed backward in his chair, dead before his servants could catch him. The official cause of death was recorded as stroke, probably accurate. His brain, already damaged by years of possible syphilis and constant rage, had finally given out. But the doctors who examined him noted something else. His body had started decomposing unusually fast. Within hours of death, the smell became unbearable. His skin began slipping off in sheets. Whatever diseases had been eating him alive continued their work after death. The court immediately erupted into chaos. Boris Godunov, Ivan's closest advisor in his final years, took control. He ordered the Tsar's body prepared for burial immediately, not out of respect, but out of necessity. The corpse was falling apart. They wrapped Ivan in layers of cloth soaked in aromatic oils, trying to mask the smell. It didn't work. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. The astrologers had been right. Ivan died on March 18th, just as they'd predicted. When Godunov went to execute them as Ivan had ordered, he found they'd already fled Moscow. They'd known the Tsar would die on schedule, and they'd known his advisors would blame them. They disappeared into the Russian countryside, never to be heard from again. The funeral was rushed. Too rushed. Normally a Tsar's body would lie in state for weeks, allowing nobles and subjects to pay respects. Ivan's body was buried within 3 days. The official explanation was respect for the deceased and urgent state business. The real reason was that the corpse had become so disgusting that keeping it above ground any longer was impossible. Prince Kurbsky, the general who'd defected to Poland years earlier, heard about Ivan's death and wrote a final letter, not to the Tsar, but to the Russian people. In it, he detailed Ivan's crimes in methodical detail: the murdered wives, the killed son, the massacred cities, the thousands of executions. He ended with a prediction: such tyrants never find peace, not in life and not in death. Their bodies rot faster than normal men, as if God himself rejects them. Kurbsky was more right than he knew. In the 1960s, Soviet researchers exhumed Ivan's remains as part of a historical investigation. What they found confirmed the worst suspicions about his final years. His bones showed extensive evidence of syphilis. His spine was severely deformed. His skull showed damage consistent with mercury poisoning from his treatments. But most disturbing were the chemical analyses. Ivan's hair and bones contained massive amounts of mercury and arsenic. Far more than could be explained by medical treatments alone. Someone had been poisoning him, slowly and carefully, for years. Probably multiple people, his doctors, his advisors, maybe even his servants. The terrible Tsar, who'd lived in constant paranoia about assassination, had been right all along. They were trying to kill him. They just took their time about it. The researchers also noted that his bones showed signs of rapid decomposition even centuries later, unusual for remains kept in the controlled environment of a cathedral. It was as if Ivan's body was still trying to rot away, still trying to escape the horror of what it had been. His legacy lasted exactly as long as his corpse. His simple-minded son Fyodor ruled for 14 years, but produced no heirs. The Rurik dynasty, which had ruled Russia for 7 centuries, ended because Ivan had killed his capable son and left only an incompetent one. Russia plunged into the time of troubles, a period of civil war, famine, and foreign invasion that killed hundreds of thousands. The Oprichnina was disbanded. The torture chambers were sealed. The black-robed death cult scattered. Everything Ivan had built with terror collapsed the moment he died. His power, absolute as it seemed, had been nothing more than the ability to inflict pain, and pain dies with the man inflicting it. The examination of Ivan's body in the 1960s revealed more than just poison and disease. It revealed the full extent of what absolute power and absolute madness had done to a human body. His skeleton showed fractures that had healed wrong. His teeth were almost completely gone, rotted away decades before death. His joints were fused in some places, probably from untreated arthritis and old injuries. But the most disturbing discovery was in his skull. The bone showed thinning consistent with long-term syphilis infection. The disease had literally eaten away at his skull from the inside, destroying brain tissue and explaining his increasingly erratic behavior in his final years. Ivan hadn't just been cruel. He'd been insane, his judgment and impulse control destroyed by bacterial infection eating his frontal lobe. The researchers published their findings in medical journals. The man who'd terrorized Russia became a case study in how untreated sexually transmitted diseases progress. His brain damage explained his paranoia, his rage, his inability to control his impulses. It didn't excuse what he'd done, but it explained the mechanism. Ivan the Terrible was, in medical terms, a man watching his own mind dissolve while still being conscious enough to know it was happening. His tomb in the Archangel Cathedral in Moscow became a curiosity rather than a shrine. No one mourned him. No one prayed for his soul. Foreign visitors would ask to see where the monster was buried, the same way they'd ask to see torture chambers and execution sites. Ivan's grave became a tourist attraction, a reminder of what happens when one person holds too much power for too long. The historical reassessment continued through the centuries. Some Russian nationalists tried to rehabilitate his image, pointing to his expansion of Russian territory and his establishment of stronger central authority. But the facts remained. Ivan killed tens of thousands of his own people. He murdered his heir. He destroyed Russia's stability. He created a system of terror that accomplished nothing except generating more terror. Modern historians estimate his personal kill count at around 60,000, though the real number could be significantly higher. That's conservative. It doesn't count the people who died from the famines and plagues that resulted from his policies. It doesn't count the soldiers who died in his wars. It doesn't count the children who died because their parents were executed. The true body count could easily be in the hundreds of thousands. But perhaps the most damning evidence of Ivan's legacy is this. When the Bolsheviks executed the Romanov family in 1918, ending Russia's monarchy forever, many Russians celebrated. Not because they loved communism, but because they remembered what czars could become. They remembered Ivan. 3 centuries after his death, his ghost still haunted Russian politics. The memory of absolute power corrupting absolutely. Ivan's story isn't unique. History is full of monarchs who descended into madness and cruelty. What makes Ivan special is how thoroughly documented his decline was. We have letters describing his mood swings, court records detailing his executions, medical evidence of his diseases, foreign ambassadors' accounts of his deterioration. We can track his transformation from troubled young ruler to genocidal monster with unusual precision. The lesson, if there is one, isn't subtle. Power doesn't corrupt in the abstract. It corrupts specifically. It rots judgment. It erodes empathy. It transforms normal human cruelty into systematic atrocity. Ivan started as a traumatized child. He ended as a rotting corpse who'd murdered his own son. The path between those 2 points was paved with absolute authority and zero accountability. His body decomposed unusually fast because it was already decomposing before he died. The diseases, the poisons, the stress, the rage. They'd been eating him alive for decades. Death just made official what had been happening all along. Ivan the Terrible died the way he lived, grotesquely and without dignity, leaving nothing behind but horror stories and mass graves. Russia eventually recovered. It always does. But it took centuries to truly escape Ivan's shadow. The autocratic tradition he embodied, the idea that one man could control everything and everyone through fear, that tradition persisted. It manifested in different forms under different names, but the core remained. Power concentrated in one person, enforced through violence, justified by necessity. Ivan's skeleton still rests in the Archangel Cathedral. Visitors can see his tomb, though not his remains. He's buried alongside his son, the one he killed. The two Ivans, father and son, murderer and victim, side by side for eternity. If there's any justice in the universe, that proximity is Ivan's real hell. Spending forever next to the one person whose death actually broke him, the one murder he regretted. The terrible Tsar wanted to be remembered. He got his wish. But not as a great ruler or successful conqueror. He's remembered as a cautionary tale. A reminder of what happens when cruelty becomes policy and madness becomes law. His legacy isn't Russia's expansion or administrative reforms. His legacy is a name that still means monster, a story parents tell to scare children. A historical footnote that reads, "Here lies proof that absolute power creates absolute horror." And his body, rotting faster than normal even in death, serves as the final metaphor. Power built on terror can't last. It decays. It falls apart. It leaves nothing but stench and disgust. Ivan proved that empires built on fear collapse the moment the fear dies. And the fear always dies with the tyrant. The man who ate his dinner while watching people burn died unable to feed himself. The man who terrorized an empire died terrified of his own mortality. The man who thought himself God's representative on earth rotted like any other corpse, only faster and worse. If there's poetry in that, it's the darkest kind. The kind that confirms what we already suspected. Monsters don't win. They just make everyone miserable until they die, and then they're forgotten except as warnings. Ivan the Terrible's story isn't about greatness corrupted. It's about how easily humans mistake cruelty for strength, violence for power, and terror for control. His body proved what his reign demonstrated. All of it was temporary. All of it was decay. All of it was rot dressed up in royal clothes and given a crown. When the clothes fell away and the crown fell off, all that remained was a corpse that couldn't decompose fast enough.